What if the biggest financial mistake you'll ever make isn't something you're doing today, but something that already happened quietly years ago? Not a dramatic decision, not a risky investment gone wrong, but a series of small, reasonable choices that felt harmless at the time. Because for most people, financial regret doesn't come from obvious failure. It comes from things that felt normal. Across the United States and Europe, many retirees in their 70s describe a similar realization. Not publicly, not on stage, but in quiet, honest conversations. I thought I was doing everything right. They worked consistently. They avoided major debt where possible. They showed up every day, earned a steady income, and supported their families. From the outside, nothing looked wrong, and that's exactly why it's worth paying attention. Because the issue isn't usually about income level. Many of these individuals were never poor in the traditional sense. They lived what most would consider a stable middle-class life. Bills were paid. Holidays happened occasionally. There was always enough to get through the month. But getting through the month and building long-term security are not the same thing. And that difference only becomes visible much later. The uncomfortable part is this: financial outcomes are often decided long before people realize they're making decisions. In your 30s and 40s, life feels full. Career growth, family responsibilities, social expectations all competing for attention. Money becomes something you manage, not something you step back and analyze deeply. If there's money left at the end of the month, it feels like progress. If there isn't, it feels temporary, something that will improve with time. But time doesn't automatically improve financial structure. It simply amplifies whatever structure already exists. That's the part most people miss. Because effort and income feel like the main variables. Work more, earn more, and things should get better. And to some extent, they do. But if the system underneath doesn't change how money is saved, spent, or allowed to grow, then higher income doesn't necessarily translate into long-term stability. It just raises the level of everything. Slightly better living, slightly higher expenses, slightly more comfort in the present, but not necessarily more security in the future. So by the time retirement approaches, many people aren't facing a sudden problem. They're facing the accumulated result of decades of normal decisions. That's why this conversation isn't about blame, and it's not about extreme financial strategies. It's about awareness. Because once you see how these patterns develop over time, you start to understand something important. Most financial regret isn't caused by one bad moment. It's caused by not fully understanding the long-term impact of ordinary ones. Let's slow this down and look at a situation that feels very ordinary. A 45-year-old employee, maybe in an office job, healthcare role, or technical position, earns around $4,500 per month after taxes. In parts of the United States or Western Europe, that's a fairly typical, stable income. Not high enough to feel wealthy, but not low enough to feel insecure either. From the outside, life looks balanced. Each month, the money is already assigned before it even arrives. Around $1,500 goes toward rent or a mortgage. Another $600 goes to a car payment, fuel, and maintenance. Groceries take about $400. Utilities, insurance, and basic services absorb another $300 to $400. Then come the less visible obligations. Minimum payments on a credit card, or perhaps an older personal loan, another $300. A few subscriptions, streaming, apps, memberships, $50 here, $20 there. Occasional meals out, social events, small comforts that make a busy life feel manageable. None of these expenses seem excessive on their own. In fact, they feel deserved. After all, this person works full-time, manages responsibilities, and isn't making reckless decisions. There's no luxury spending, no extreme lifestyle. Just a steady pattern of earning and spending that feels normal. By the end of the month, there might be $200 left, sometimes $300, sometimes nothing at all, depending on unexpected costs. And this is where the situation becomes quietly important, because having a small amount left over feels like progress. It creates the sense that things are under control. But in reality, this leftover amount is often too small and too inconsistent to build meaningful long-term stability. There's no structured system behind it, no clear direction for where that remaining money should go. Some months it stays in the account. Other months it disappears into unplanned expenses. Over time, this creates a pattern where income is fully consumed by lifestyle, even if that lifestyle seems modest. And psychologically, this pattern is very easy to justify. The mind frames it as balance. I'm not overspending. I'm not in serious debt. I'll save more when things settle down. But things rarely settle down in a lasting way. Costs shift, priorities change, new expenses replace old ones. So the structure remains the same even as income slowly increases. A raise might add $300 more per month. But within a year, that extra amount is often absorbed slightly better groceries, a newer phone, more comfortable living choices. Again, nothing extreme, just gradual adjustment, and that's the key point. This isn't a story about financial irresponsibility. It's a story about a system that was never designed to create distance between earning and spending. So decades pass with consistent effort, steady income, and responsible behavior, but without a clear mechanism for building something that lasts beyond the monthly cycle. And by the time this becomes visible, the window to benefit fully from time has already narrowed. The first big regret, one of the most consistent regrets people express later in life, is surprisingly simple. I should have started earlier. Not necessarily with larger amounts, not with complex investments, just earlier. Because time, more than income, is what quietly determines long-term financial outcomes. But this isn't always obvious when you're younger. In your 20s and 30s, financial decisions don't seem urgent. Retirement feels distant, almost abstract. There's always the assumption that there will be more time later, more income later, more stability later. So saving gets delayed, not ignored, just postponed. It might start with a thought like, I'll begin once I'm earning a bit more. Then later, I'll start after this loan is paid off. Then, once things calm down. But things rarely calm down in a permanent way. Life continues to introduce new priorities: housing, family, unexpected expenses. And each time, saving is pushed slightly further into the future. From a psychological perspective, this makes sense. The human brain is wired to prioritize immediate needs over distant ones. A bill due this week feels real. Retirement 30 years from now does not. So even financially responsible people fall into a pattern of delaying it because they lack discipline, but because the system around them doesn't create urgency. The problem is, time doesn't pause while decisions are being delayed. And this is where the math begins to matter. Imagine two individuals. The first starts setting aside $300 per month at age 25. The second waits until 45 to begin doing the same. On the surface, the difference doesn't feel dramatic, just a delay of 20 years. But those 20 years are where most of the growth happens. Money that is invested or saved earlier has more time to compound. It doesn't just grow linearly, it builds on itself. So the person who starts earlier isn't just contributing more months of savings. They're allowing each dollar more time to multiply. By contrast, the person who starts at 45 faces a different reality. There's less time for growth, less room for compounding to take effect, and often more pressure to make up for lost time. This pressure can lead to uncomfortable choices: saving aggressively at the expense of current lifestyle, or taking on higher risk investments in an attempt to accelerate growth. Neither option feels stable. And this is why the regret isn't about not doing enough. It's about not understanding how valuable time actually was. Because once time passes, it can't be recovered through effort alone. You can increase income, you can reduce expenses, but you can't recreate decades of compounding. So by the time many people reach their 60s or 70s, the realization becomes clear. It wasn't about finding the perfect strategy. It was about starting a simple one much earlier. And that's what makes this regret so common, because the decision to delay never felt like a mistake when it was happening. The second and third regrets, another pattern that shows up repeatedly in retirement conversations, is dependence on a single source of income. For most of adult life, this feels completely normal. You get a job, you build experience. Your income slowly increases over time. There's a sense of stability in that structure. A reliable paycheck creates predictability, and predictability feels safe. So naturally, most people organize their entire financial life around that one stream. Monthly expenses are designed to match it. Long-term commitments like mortgages or car payments are based on it. Even future expectations are built around the assumption that this income will continue. And for many years it does, which is exactly why the risk remains invisible, because the system works until it doesn't. Jobs change, industries evolve, Companies restructure, health can interfere, energy levels shift with age, and eventually, retirement removes that income entirely. At that point, the question becomes very simple: what replaces it? For many, the answer is limited pensions, savings, or government support. But these are often smaller and more fixed than expected. So the lifestyle that was built over decades suddenly has to adjust to a different financial reality. At the same time, another pattern has been developing quietly alongside this: lifestyle expansion. This doesn't happen dramatically. It's not about luxury or excess. It's gradual. A slightly higher salary leads to slightly higher rent. A better car replaces an older one. Vacations become a bit more comfortable. Daily spending becomes a little less strict. Each upgrade feels reasonable, earned. And individually, none of these decisions seem harmful, but over time, they create something important: a financial structure where expenses rise in parallel with income. So instead of income creating extra space for future security, it simply supports a more comfortable present. This is often called lifestyle drift, but it doesn't feel like drift when you're living it. It feels like progress, and that's where the disconnect begins. Because while income increases over the years, the ability to save and invest meaningfully doesn't increase at the same rate. There's no growing gap between what is earned and what is spent. So even after decades of working, many people arrive at their 50s or 60s with a lifestyle that depends heavily on continued income, but without a system that can sustain it independently. Psychologically, this is easy to understand. Humans adapt quickly to improved circumstances. What once felt like a luxury becomes normal, and once something becomes normal, it's very difficult to step back from it. So instead of locking in financial gains for the future, most of those gains are absorbed into the present. And again, this isn't about poor decisions. It's about a system that rewards short-term comfort over long-term independence. Which is why, later in life, the realization isn't, "I spent recklessly." It's more subtle than that. "I earned more, but I didn't keep enough of the difference." The fourth and fifth regrets there are two final patterns that tend to surface later than the others, but once they do, they're difficult to ignore. The first is underestimating inflation. For most of adult life, inflation feels like background noise. Prices go up slowly, almost quietly. A grocery bill increases a little. Utility costs shift slightly. Services become marginally more expensive. Year to year, it doesn't feel dramatic enough to demand attention, so people adapt without thinking too much about it. If groceries cost $50 more this month, it's manageable. If energy bills rise, adjustments are made elsewhere. If rent increases, it's justified as part of normal economic movement. Nothing feels urgent. But over decades, these small increases don't remain small. They compound. A cost that rises by just a few percent each year can double over time. And when this happens across multiple categories: housing, food, healthcare, transportation, the total impact becomes significant. The problem is, income doesn't always follow the same pattern. During working years, salaries may increase gradually. Promotions, job changes, and experience can help offset rising costs. But in retirement, income often becomes fixed. Pensions, savings withdrawals, or government benefits typically don't adjust at the same pace as real-world expenses, especially not healthcare, which tends to rise faster than average inflation. This creates a slow but consistent imbalance, not a sudden financial crisis, just a gradual tightening. Month by month, the same amount of money buys a little less. At first, it's barely noticeable. Then it becomes inconvenient. Eventually, it becomes restrictive. And by that point, there's limited flexibility to respond. The second pattern is the absence of a clear long-term plan. Many people don't actively design how their finances should function over 20 or 30 years. Instead, they manage money in shorter cycles: month-by-month budgets, annual adjustments, immediate priorities. This approach works well in the short term. Bills get paid, obligations are met. Life moves forward without disruption. But long-term financial stability requires a different perspective. It requires thinking in decades, not months. Without that perspective, decisions are made reactively rather than intentionally. If expenses increase, adjustments are made. If income changes, spending adapts. If something unexpected happens, savings are used if available. But there's no overarching structure guiding these decisions toward a specific long-term outcome. Psychologically, this is completely natural. The human brain is not wired to plan 30 years ahead in detail. It prioritizes what feels immediate and tangible. A bill due this week demands attention. A potential financial shortfall 25 years from now does not. So even disciplined individuals can spend decades operating without a clear financial direction. And when these two factors combine, rising costs and no long-term plan, the result is predictable. A gradual loss of control. Not because of one mistake, not because of lack of effort, but because the system was never designed to anticipate how time, cost, and income would interact over the long run. And by the time that interaction becomes visible, the ability to adjust it easily is already limited. By the time people reach retirement and begin reflecting on their financial life, the conclusions they arrive at are rarely dramatic. There's no single turning point they point to. No one decision that clearly went wrong. Instead, the pattern is quiet and consistent. A series of reasonable choices made over many years that never quite aligned into a system designed for long-term stability. And this is where the perspective begins to shift. Because when you look at individuals who feel relatively secure in their 60s and 70s, the difference isn't that they earn dramatically more. In many cases, their incomes were similar, their careers were similar, their lifestyles, at least on the surface, didn't look radically different. What changed was how they thought about money early enough for it to matter. They didn't see income as something to fully consume. They saw it as something to divide, with a portion consistently set aside before lifestyle expanded. They didn't assume stability would last forever. They expected change, job shifts, health changes, economic shifts, and quietly prepared for it. They didn't rely entirely on one source of income, even if one source was dominant. Over time, they looked for ways, however small, to create additional streams or build assets that could function independently. And importantly, they didn't treat time as unlimited. They understood, even if only roughly, that starting earlier gave them options later. Not perfect outcomes, just flexibility. That's the real distinction. Because financial security in later life isn't about reaching a specific number. It's about having room to adjust, room to handle rising costs, room to respond to unexpected events, room to maintain a certain quality of life without constant pressure. And that kind of flexibility is rarely built quickly. It's built slowly, often without visible results in the beginning, which is why it's easy to overlook. Especially when the alternative of spending a little more today, living a little more comfortably now, feels immediate and tangible. But over time, those small differences in behavior create entirely different outcomes. One path leads to dependence on fixed income with limited options. The other leads to a degree of control, even in later years. Not complete freedom, but enough stability to make decisions calmly rather than react under pressure. And that's ultimately what most people are hoping for, whether they articulate it or not. Not wealth in an extreme sense. Just a life where financial concerns don't dominate every decision. So this isn't about trying to correct the past. It's about recognizing how these patterns work while there's still time for them to matter. Because once you understand that most financial outcomes are the result of long-term structure, not short-term effort, your focus naturally shifts from reacting to designing. And if this way of thinking brings a bit more clarity to how you see your own financial decisions, you can subscribe for more calm, realistic conversations like this.